Kurt and Nick have been focusing on the subject of the course, which is the canon of Scripture, the creation of the canon. I'm not going to try to add to their discussion. I haven't studied the things that they have been doing, but I do want to spend a few minutes this morning on a side issue that is connected to the canon, and that is the transmission of Scripture. You know, that word is maybe funny to some of you. Transmission is not like the transmission on your car. Transmission is the transmitting of the inspired Word of God and preserving it and protecting it from one generation to the next. And now we have 2,000 years of New Testament material, as well as all of the Old Testament material that goes 2,000 years back beyond that and has been protected from one generation to the next as well. So I'm focusing on the way that has been handed down and how it is that we have wound up with what we have. I'm only going to be able to get as far as the 17th century this morning, but you'll get the picture. You'll get the understanding. The Old Testament, just to start off with, was preserved in a very deliberate and religious fashion. Maybe this has already been covered to some extent by the other two men, but the law, particularly the Torah, was always revered carefully, and when it was required to be copied, when the copies that were present were wearing out, the copyists would establish very strict rules about copying the Word of God in the process, and did it very deliberately and very carefully. And then, once the copies were done and approved and compared and recognized, it became the habit of the Jews to, out of reverence for the older copies that were now wearing out and falling apart, to burn them. And so we would not have older records. We would just have the ones that they have released and approved, and then that they would serve their lifetime, and then upon the reproduction of those, the older ones themselves would be burned again. And so there was a great science and a great care to pass down the writings of the Old Testament, and the prophets and the history became added into that as time went on. There was a great reverence and a great care that was always applied to that. And that is just, I summarize that very quickly, because that is going to be in great contrast to how the New Testament is copied and multiplied, because it's very, very different. When we get to the time of the early Christian era, the first 3 centuries of the Christian faith, as it's developing and growing, and as the persecution of Rome intensifies from one Caesar to the next, the writings of Paul, particularly, which is the earliest writings we have, were duplicated very quickly. And to get the word out, to get the gospel out, to get the words of Paul out, they were duplicated very quickly and passed on to various churches. And so they were often hastily made, not with deliberate care and patience, but just simply getting the copies done as fast as possible. And of course, remember, these were all handwritten, and it's a very tedious process. Today, we have been able to discover, find some 5,000 manuscripts of that earliest period of time. Not complete, of course, bits and pieces, but we're able to go to trace the actual writings themselves back to the early 2nd century, which helps us to underscore the authenticity of them. And we find that the Scriptures also show up, the New Testament Scriptures also show up in other writings, not only the canonical ones themselves, but they show up in letters of the early church fathers, like Ignatius, Polycarp, and others that would copy from the writing of Paul in a very copious fashion, so that it would lend authority to what those church fathers were teaching. Then you had men like Tertullian and other apologists who defended the faith against rising heresies, against opposition and criticism. And they would also quote from the writings of Paul particularly, as well as the Gospels. And so we have record of that in terms of what the actual writing of the original would have said. And then we also, lo and behold, have the quotations generously given to us in writings of heresy. The Gnostics, either they were arguing against the Christian faith, or they were saying, we're just like them too. They would quote from Paul, and we have those writings to compare and contrast. And so we're able to gather a whole host of ancient writings that go back very, very far, and the process of that developed very quickly into a science called textual criticism. They didn't call it that at the time, but the point is they would say, all right, now as we're reading this one and this one, we notice some very small differences. We notice one thing, some enormous similarities, but every once in a while we notice some small differences. And what do we do with those differences? And they would lay out as the scripture, the text they have, and they would trace those copies with those differences. Let me give you a real simple illustration to show you what I'm talking about. Let's say that this is the original writing of Paul up here, where he says at any particular given point, referring to Jesus, the only Son of God, and that the copies made from that faithfully replicate that, but eventually you get to where one copyist might leave out an adjective or a descriptive, or what's also discovered is that in some cases someone would have great reverence for what he's writing and add an adjective in. The one holy and magnificent Son of God, or something like that. Well, those small additions and those kinds of things never affect the doctrine that is taught in the Scriptures. These are just little emendations, little additions or errors that are useful to tracing where those copies come from. So you can see that after that mistake, after that was made, then the copies from that would show up later and even later, whereas the difference would be seen by that time. So we figured out that you could actually trace what we call a family tree. Okay, this addition or this absentia can be traced all the way back in this direction, and these can be traced perhaps in another direction. And what the result of that is that we found that there are basically three different groups of texts, or three different family trees that we have to trace these writings back to. And they call these three families the Alexandrian, meaning texts that they found following the ones in Africa, the Western texts, and the Byzantine texts. Those are generally speaking, the largest three groups or families of writings that we have from those early days. Then we noticed that they took stock of the fact that the writing themselves were not on animal hides and on vellum or things that would preserve the writings like the Old Testament texts were already, but these were hastily written on whatever they could find, and the most common thing that people would use, everything from your laundry list to your shopping list, your note to your mother, to legal documents, to canonical writings, were all done on papyrus. Now, papyrus is a grass that grows in moist areas, like around seabeds or other swampy areas like that. Copious in Egypt particularly, but also in Canaan. And you would get these tall papyrus reeds, and you could slice them vertically and then tease the stalk apart and actually attach it to other stalks, and you come up with a sheet of paper, if you can use that term, that looks kind of like that. And then that would be the thing they would write on. Here is one of the oldest papyrus writings we have. This is from John 1:48 to 2:3, and it's in Geneva. And so you can see the writing on the papyrus paper. But while we're looking at this, I also want you to take note of the writing itself. You notice that it's just written rather freehand, and that some letters will look differently than others, just like your freehand writing will do. It doesn't always look the same. And you'll notice there's no spaces. There's no grammatical marks. It's just blah, 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 blah. And the reader of the Greek is supposed to be able to parse that out as you read it. But it was just common not to do anything like those, like spaces or periods or commas or semicolons. It was just simply getting the text on the paper and getting the text out there. But of course, because it's papyrus, it's organic, this is not subject to last very long. Thus the reason why more and more copies had to be made fast and fast and fast, because these are subject to just simply decay. You leave it out in the sun too long and it's going to start breaking up. You roll it up too tight and you can't unroll it. It becomes very fragile very quick, because it's obviously not meant to be permanent. So the very fact that we have some today is pretty remarkable. And they're always preserved in acrylic and under glass and with special lighting, because we don't want to lose them. It's wonderful and it's marvelous. But one of the things that we are comforted by is that when we are challenged with skeptics, religious skeptics as well as agnostics, skeptics who say the Bible's been changed and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. We can go back to the very beginning of the 2nd century and say, look, it's the same thing. Translations we have today are based not on somebody's rewriting of the text later, it's based on the originals. It's based on as far back as we can go. And so we want to protect those because they help us to understand that. You get to the age of Constantine. Now we're in the 4th century. Constantine, you remember, was the emperor who became converted and favored Christianity. And all of a sudden, Christianity was a popular religion. It was the church was the place to be. The king is there. You want to schmooze with the king? I'm a Christian too. And everybody became, and Christianity became royal and became rich and opulent. And now you had church buildings and you had priests or ministers who walk down the street with robes on and not worry about being arrested. And so things completely changed. Freedom and liberty and luxury were all embraced by the Christian church. They liked this. This is okay. They didn't think too far ahead about what influence that might have, but they said, this is much better than being beaten and burned at the stake. So in the process of that, they also had the freedom now to consider preserving the writings of Scripture in a more deliberate fashion. And so how do we do that? And of course, the first thing they do is they turn to animal hides, which is the same thing that the Old Testament texts have been preserved on for many centuries. And they would dry out the hides, and then they would cut them and they would write on them. And the art of producing scrolls and books, if you will, even became very popular. And the care of them increased, as well as the reproduction. The care of writing them out now changed. Now they did get more deliberately. Were attending to the care of reproducing the texts of Paul's writings and of the Gospels. And as a result of that, they developed another style of writing, which was a little easier on the eyes. It's called uncial. And this cleaned up the writing, gave it more structure, didn't change the words, it changed the writing, the spelling, the grammatical approach. And the act of copying required much more investment in time and money, but now you had both. Now you had time and money to give to such things. Constantine liked the idea of moving forward in this, and so he ordered 50, what he referred to as sturdy Bibles, to be put in all the churches. And we still have a couple of those, very famous ones that have been preserved all this time. One is called the Codex Vaticanus. And if you can see in this, you can see that there is already much more care and development taken in regarding the copying. This is in 3 columns, and it's much easier to read. The uncial style leaves spaces, and you can already see some grammatical additions there that will help to unfold that. Another copy we have is the Codex Sinaiticus. And of course, the names of these are based on where they were found. And the finding of them is a story in itself. Let me just illustrate that by focusing on the Codex Sinaiticus. First of all, this was something done in the 4th century. So it's a 4th century text. And we have to wait until the 17th century to find it. The 18th century. In 1761, Vatiano Donati visited St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, Egypt. First of all, St. Catherine's Monastery is a church that was built at the foot of what they thought was Mount Sinai in Constantine's day. And so out of reverence for that, they built a church on the site, and Constantine named it after his mother. So here's this Italian, and he is visiting St. Catherine's Monastery, misspelling, monastery in Sinai, Egypt. And this is what he writes. In this monastery, I found a great number of parchment codices. There are some which seem to be written before the 7th century, and especially a Bible made of beautiful vellum, very large, thin and square parchments, written in round and very beautiful letters. Moreover, there are also in the church a Greek evangelisterium in gold and round letters. It should be very old. So the first of he just came across this in the monastery. They weren't necessarily displaying it. They weren't using it. It was kind of stuck in the library. And so he's marveling at this. Apparently wasn't able to recover it. But he said he found it. He saw it there. And then we had to wait a whole nother century, 1846. And a man named Konstantin von Titzendorf visited St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, and he records he saw some leaves of parchment in a wastebasket. They were rubbish, which was about to be destroyed by burning it in the ovens of the monastery. Now, we can't presume or project motives here. Remember what I said about, how the Old Testament would in proper fashion or in respect for the older texts that were wearing out, they would burn them. So we don't know if that's what's going on here. Or it could be that the monks in the monastery just didn't realize what they had and just, more trash. We're just like we got a dumpster outside, going to get rid of stuff we don't need anymore. We haven't used it for years, toss it out. Anyway, Count Titzendorf found it, was apoplectic about what he found. He retrieved 129 leaves and was able to return with only 43. Apparently, when he made this known to the monks, they realized, what we've got here. And they wouldn't let him take more than 43 of them, even though they were going to destroy them. Now they're valuable. Now we got to keep them. Later, Captain MacDonald also visited the monastery. He was able to purchase the codices from the monastery. That's what they were after, And now it's the Sinaiticus Codex is preserved and protected, and like I said, that goes all the way back to the 4th century, and so we could even compare that with English translations today. Today, we have over 44 of those major uncial manuscripts. Not just the first two that were kind of discovered by accident, but now we have 44 of them that are building the whole library of that age. So it goes all the way back, and that's a pretty impressive thing to realize. Then we come up to the 9th century. Now this is the age of Charlemagne. The Roman Empire has collapsed. The barbarians have come down. Rome has been sacked. Everybody's fled the cities, and literacy rates are dropping rapidly. Okay, Charlemagne is of the Franks in the West. He has become a Christian. He is devoted to the idea of restoring civilization with a Christian influence and world and life view. So he is a good guy. And he promotes art, and he promotes literature, and he promotes science, and he promotes music, and he promotes all of the liberal arts, as they say, and encourages them in his realm. And so, during his time, a newer style of writing has been developed. This is even more familiar to us, even to what we have today. A new style. This is it's not called minuscule, it's called minuscule. Sounds professional that way, right? Minuscule. It's not minuscule, it's minuscule. Okay, get with the program. And we have over 500 of such writings recovered and inventoried. And you remember those family trees I talked about? Now there's up to 11 different groupings or families that help us to trace back the origins. Now, so we have a whole bunch of writings. We have ancient papyrus, we have uncials, we have minuscules, we have writings from heresies, we have quotations, we've got the Gospels themselves, we've got Paul, we've got thousands and thousands of documents. And we have close to 5 to 11 different family trees we've been able to trace. And so now the question is, what do we do with the similarities? The similarities prove the value of the text, but what do we do with the differences? How can we come up with, how do we know what was actually written? And so that's where this science of textual criticism comes up. Textual criticism is a good thing, and it helps us to study the various families and the various small things that additions or subtractions that are made. And when we talk about those, we're not there. At no point are we talking about anything that corrupts the doctrine of the Christian faith. We're only talking about additions of adjectives or the absence of, sometimes a writer would skip an entire line. And then that would be transferred to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Or, like I said, sometimes they feel like, oh, I love the Lord so much, I'm going to embellish this and add a few more things to it. But those are always traceable. Now we have clues as to where they came from. And so some family trees are known for being more flowery. Their copyists were all too eager to add wonderful, praiseworthy things, adjectives and adverbs to the text. Others were more Spartan. Somewhere along the line they just simply dropped an adjective or a sentence or something, and so we're able to figure that out. That all leaves clues for us to figure out the tracings. And now, going by the character and the quality of the family tree, we can say this family tree is more fuzzy, more, to use a word gently, more corrupted than this tree over here. And so we're going to lean less on this group than we are on this one. This one we rely on more than on this one. And that would you would grow in that science. And the pursuit is always with the idea we're going to try to find what the real original source meant. So the passion of textual science has always been getting to what the original actually said. And that's a wonderful thing for us to have. Make this work. This is an example of the minuscule style. This is the first page of Matthew out of another codex. Gives a close-up of it. And Now, of course, this is in Latin, so you can't read it. But notice, if you will, now remember, this is still handwritten, but notice this. Notice how these letters all look exactly the same. There's no scribble here. You look at these letters, those look exactly the same. There's a science to the reproduction that makes it as very explicitly, carefully done as possible. And of course, there's spaces and there's grammatical additions. So if you are reading this, if you're fluent in this and you're able to, you read this with ease. Now this is not something you have to sit down and study and parse. You can read this very easily, and it just flows before your eyes. Minuscules also were known for the fact that they spread all of these different languages out and copied in all of these various languages long before the Wycliffe Bible translators were committed to translating the Bible into all languages. Even by the 9th century, the church was already doing that very eagerly. Here's Jerome's Vulgate. Now, Jerome's Vulgate was the first Latin translation in the 4th century. Here is a 9th century reproduction of it. That's done with that minuscule style, and so it's very easy to read. Come on. There it is in close-up. And again, if you were reading in Latin, you could read that very easily. And they've been copied in a host of other languages. Now we have the Bible written in Syriac, Latin, Coptic, Gothic, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic, Slavonic, Arabic, and Nubian. And because we've been a whole nother 10,000 years, now textual science can go back and look at those languages and how they've been translated. So now there's a dispute about whether there's a comma here or a word there. Now we have even more to compare and to contrast and study against the family tree development. You get up to the medieval age. This is 1000 to 1500. The written word is now at a crisis point. Civilization has, except for the church herself, civilization has all but collapsed. The only civilization that is being functioned and developed is in monasteries. And many of the existing texts that were copied and made available up to that point are now being lost. Nobody's reading them. Or they're being destroyed. The barbarians are still swooping down from the north. They still raid, they still pillage, they still burn. They burn entire libraries at a time because they don't care. And so there's lots of these that are subject to destruction. Others are simply shelved. They're stored. You know how it is with things that are old. Put it in the back shelf. Don't worry about it. Years later, it's still there. We just forget about it. So they're stored, or they're sent off to obscure locations. You know, the little monastery off in Ireland that never gets any money. We'll send them some old copies that we don't use anymore, and they would be over there, and they'd be forgotten. And so the copies that would be spread out and left to obscure situations. The conditions of existence are poor. People are hand-to-mouth. The deterioration of these texts is common. You don't have special humidity-controlled rooms to protect these things in. The light's exposure to them. The dust, the bugs. There's no way to control the deterioration of these things, and so all of that is happening at this time. The breakdown of the Roman Empire is followed by the Black Plague. Now, who cares about writings? We're talking about survival. And over a third of the population of Europe perishes in the various sweepings of the Black Plague, one time wave after another. And so as a result of that, education takes a very deep dive. And not only do you not know how to read, you don't care. And what's paper for? Burning. And so the copies that we have are threatened at this stage of the game. The Pope in Rome sees the situation and says we have to close ranks and we have to preserve what we've got lest it all be destroyed. And so he asserts his own authority. And he does so in some very rigid guidelines. He says, first of all, I don't think, who can know whether we can trust all of these copies that are being made? We're going to limit it to Latin. Latin is the official language of the empire. We're going to limit the reading of the Bible to Latin. We're not going to trust anything else that's out there. We're not going to have anything to do with anything out there. And furthermore, because people are illiterate, they're falling into more and more superstition. They're listening to more and more voices. And so we're going to make it necessary that you don't read this on your own and think you know it all. You're going to have to go by what the priest tells you so that you get the word straight. And so this overarching enforcement of law about unauthorized reading and interpreting scriptures on one's own is forbidden. So it actually starts as an effort to preserve civilization rather than to see it destroyed, which is ironic because when we come to the Reformation, it's turned into a great deep oppression of people's freedoms. And that's sometimes all we see. But this is the beginning of that. This is the age, in other words, when preservation of existing texts become very important. We'll start with the Old Testament texts. The Jewish preservation of the Old Testament has always been very carefully done, very deliberately done. There were a whole bunch of rules about what the copyist could do and what the copyist couldn't do. And if he messed up in any of those rules, he'd have to start over. It was just very deliberate. However, by this time, by the medieval age, by this time, even among the Jews, the Hebrew language has disappeared. None of us talk Hebrew anymore. And a group of scholars called the Masoretes realized we got to preserve not only the writing, but the pronunciation of this so that you could actually read this out loud. Nobody knows Hebrew anymore. And so the Masoretes said we have to do this. So their family, their care for the Old Testament writings became known as the Masoretic text. And what they did was to preserve not only the reading but the speaking of the Hebrew language. They came up with a system that this would be like the original writing here. You can see the Hebrew letters. They came up with a system by which you could pronounce the words correctly. And so they came up with all these dots and dashes, all these grammatical points and arrows and squiggly marks, and that's the way that seminarians have to learn to read Hebrew today, is all squiggly marks. Drove me crazy. I hated Hebrew. Anyway, that's referred to today as the Masoretic text, and that's the standard. That's what everybody uses, is the Masoretic pointing system. Christian efforts to find older texts of the Old Testament. Now you not only had Jews who were trying to keep their copies, but also Christians are now curious about the Old Testament. And so they're doing their own digging and preserving. But they realized they could only go back as far as the 14th century. That's as far back as it went. That's important to remember. 14th century, that's the 1300s. And the reason for that is because when the older texts were it was a reverent thing to do to destroy them rather than just let them deteriorate. The oldest Hebrew Bible you could get was the 14th century. And so that, in the medieval age, that doesn't leave you a lot of time. That's maybe your text is only 100 years old, and that's as far back as it goes. That could be a problem when they're challenged for authenticity. Is that really what the copies before them said? Good question. But in the meantime, the science of comparing historical and ancient texts began overshadowing the influence of the control and influence of the Masoretes, the Christians became more and more involved in preserving the texts and restoring the text than even the Jews were interested or concerned in doing. As far as the New Testament texts are concerned, now the popularity was with that everybody wanted not only a copy of the Bible, not, the New Testament, but they were willing to pay for it, and so the monks would be preoccupied with decorating the text and making it as beautiful as they possibly could. The gospel had to be loftily decorated, and so you started to see deluxe editions of the Gospels. Now that's all the rage. Various scriptoriums would compete with one another on who could make the most beautiful copy of the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, and that complete with expensive materials and painstaking artwork. And it would be added to now with drawings and illustrations, Baroque decoration, employment of gold and silver, fiber and ink, purple vellum, and expensive and elaborate bindings. Older, plainer copies were again shelved, destroyed. Just the way of the old. New is always nice, Invasions from barbarians, as I mentioned before, from the north, or even now Muslims. Now the Muslims are sweeping up from the south, and they're destroying libraries, and they're doing the same thing the barbarians were, and burning down churches and not caring about the idea of preserving a Christian civilization. And so they would destroy anything they could find. Many similar destructions happened throughout the period of the Crusades. We hear, the Crusades were all about taking over the Holy Land again. But it was war, and every time you have war, you break things and murder people. And so things would get destroyed, and Jerusalem was the center of that. And so there's lots of things. And so it made copying, the process of copying more aggressive. Let's make the copies and get them out there. Then you come up to the pre-Reformation movement, and this was the 1384. That's the lifespan of John Wycliffe. You've probably heard of John Wycliffe. He was an English Catholic priest and a professor of theology in Oxford. In other words, this is in England. So now the focus is going to be more predominantly on English as a translation. That hasn't been the case before now. And you remember, the Pope has now forbidden translations out of Latin. And so this upstart monk professor is making waves, and he's calling for Reformation principles already. He's saying people ought to be able to read the Bible. What's wrong with that? We need freedom of religion here. We need, and he would advocate many of the things that the Catholic Church now were deliberately trying to suppress. And he advocated for a translation of the Bible into Middle English for everybody to read. Everybody should be able to read the Bible. What do you mean you can't read the Bible? And he was derided for that, but he pressed forward for other reforms as well. And he managed to get a Bible printed that we refer to as the Wycliffe Bible in 1382. There's a copy of it. You can see the decoration that's all in style now, and the shape of it, and the double-columned minuscule print, and that was a very elegant design. Wycliffe died in 1384 peaceably. He was buried in consecrated ground. End of story, right? Oh no. In the Council of Constance in 1415, his case was finally brought to trial. He was condemned posthumously, and of course, according to Catholic understanding, you can't be buried in consecrated ground, whatever that is, if you're a heretic. And so they dug up Wycliffe's bones, and they burned them, and they dumped the ashes in the river. Nuts to you, John. Okay, big deal. But they thought that was the best they could do under the circumstances. Then came along the Gutenberg press. Now this changes everything. This changes everything. The whole idea that now we have somebody running a business who can put print together and then lay it out and print it on a piece of paper and make multiple copies of it with ease is a remarkable advance. It's still extremely tedious setting the plates, extremely tedious setting the plates, but once the plates are set, sky's the limit. And that's all neat and clean and readable, and it just changes the whole world of printing. In 1450, although it is contested as to actually who made the first printing press, there's a competition going on. Gutenberg's name is the one we remember. Gutenberg's press is made in 1450. He is printing like crazy to not only get the literature out, but also to make his business grow and to draw attraction to himself. And by 1456, he is ready to print the Bible. And he comes up with the Latin Bible, the Vulgate. He comes up with the Vulgate. That's an old picture, isn't it? Anyway, he comes up with the first printed Bible, the Latin Vulgate, in 1456. And now there's all kinds of other things that come into the mix of discussions regarding translations that wasn't there before. The monks never charged money for this. The monks were never worried about getting credit for copies. You just made them. They're the glory of God. But now there's other circumstances that come into the mix. Marketing. I have to make money off of this. Copyright legalities begin to be an issue. And political influences and manipulation also begin to add into the mix. Those things have never gone away from the printing of the Bible to this day. We still rely on for-profit publishers, independent of the church, to come up with translations of their choice. And what they print is theirs, and we have to pay. When you buy a copy, you are paying the publisher, and the church is not directly involved. I mean, you may have a host of excellent translators, but they've been paid too, and so it's a whole different world that we're in now that wasn't there before. The period also brings us the age of analysis. Now we're analyzing various translations that we've coming up with. That school starts to build. In 1412, De Staples' version of the Vulgate is corrected. Jerome's Vulgate is corrected from the Greek. That's unheard of. The Vulgate was the Pope's Bible. You don't mess with the Pope's Bible. And now we're correcting it from the Greek, from the ancient Greek. And so that's an interesting step. Just to be, just to give you a curiosity here. In 1514, de Cisneros' team creates the Complutensian Polyglot, which is a scholar's dream. It's a compilation of scriptures in the Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin, all together. There it is. You can read to your heart's content. You can study to your heart's content. You can compare languages. You can compare. There's not, and this is also something that's new here. You not only have the various languages that are written here. Here's the Hebrew. All the various languages that are written out here. You also have notations on the side. Now, notations on the side here would talk about various controversial spellings. This person spelled this word this way, another family tree spelled it this way, so we're just giving you notations about that. Sometimes it would be opinions of the editors. We think that this is probably the best translation here. But there are other writings that don't say that, the other family trees, And so notations begin to show up in translation work that helps the reader to understand what he's reading and where it comes from and make up his mind as to which direction he should go. Hello. Let's see, where was I? In 1516, I remember we're 1 year away from Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. In 1516, Erasmus, also racing to the publisher because he's under competition with somebody else. Erasmus is a humanistic philosopher, and he finally releases the Novum Instrumentum Omni, which is the first Greek New Testament published. So it's a Greek-Latin parallel. And you can see the original. Now you as a reader can see the Greek and you can see the Latin, and you can see how the Greek's been translated. And there's others that are doing. He also does something which was very brand new. He secures publication privileges. You know what that is? Copyright. The very first copyright. Nobody else can do this. Nobody else can use my stuff and print it somewhere else without my name. I have publication privileges, and Erasmus included, he thought this idea of notations was very good, and so he adds even more scholarly annotations, more things to help the reader understand what he's reading. More of those notations are added. In 1552, Osiander publishes a corrected Vulgate and a Gospel Harmony. So now we're not rewriting what's there to suit modern taste. It's just the opposite. Now we're going as far back as we can, and we're bringing that old forward. Now we're not saying, well, we don't like the way this, we don't like what this says, so I'm going to rewrite it and go on from there. No, we're tracing it back. We're getting more and more closer to the original in our publications all the time. And Luther then also, after he gets into trouble with Rome, he flees, he hides out in Germany, and he and his team translate the Bible into German. And so now we have a German translation of the Bible to compare and to contrast to. There's a growing number of inventory of sources that are available to us by this time. Jerome's Vulgate, which was originally in 382, was always held and esteemed by the Roman Church. But there's other older now, Hebrew, Greek, and other language texts that are coming to light. And they are starting to show some, even with, that's why we correct the Vulgate now. Because the texts that Jerome was using back in the 4th century, now we have even older texts. And we need to correct that and get more toward the original as we can. And so the science of textual comparison is beginning to grow, and publishers also are growing very cautious about their investments. Now publishers are asking questions like, which text are we talking about? What family tree did you get this from? Where, how do we know? Is this going to be the best deal for the time? And they're worried in a business sense as to what they're having and developing. Then we come to William Tyndale. William Tyndale, of course, is very well known by many people. He will become the father of English translation. And it all starts because he witnessed a public execution of 6 men and a woman who had the audacity to teach their children the 10 Commandments. Recite the Lord's Prayer. Remember what the Pope said. You will not have anything, the priests are the only ones officially to teach. You cannot do that. And he actually executed people during Henry VIII's time for disobeying that. That was before, well, I don't know where it falls with regard to the growth of the Anglican Church. But anyway, that was something that he just appalled him and shocked him to the core, and he became committed to saying, I'm going to translate the Bible into English in England, and I don't care what it may do to me. And so he commits his life to translating the Bible into English. He manages to get the work done in 1534. He's in exile for his life. And so he's smuggling English translations into England in fish barrels and things like that so that it gets in. And of course, this is driving the King Henry VIII nuts. This is not approved by, I don't want anything to do with this. And so he has, whenever he sees them, he has them burned. He arrests the people that do it. He's very angry, and he's put a bounty on Tyndale's head. That's too much for one of his dear friends to bear. And one of his dear friends turns him in. And Tyndale is brought back to England, and he's tried, and he's burned at the stake. The last words he says is a prayer saying, "Lord, open the eyes of the king." That was 1536. In there's a copy of one of his, St. John's opening chapter. You see how beautiful the English is. In the beginning, you can read it. And this marks the spot upon which Tyndale was burned. That was 1536. But other publications are already happening all around. And Henry VIII sees the writing on the wall, if you will. And so he says, okay, we're going to allow English translations, but it's only under my supervision. That's how he decided he would control it. And so in 1535, I should be 1536, the first copy of the Coverdale Bible came out. This was the first complete modern edition. It was based, he wouldn't admit it, but it was based on Tyndale's English translation work. It was basically Tyndale's work with a different name. And it carried something called the Royal License. Now, the Royal License meant that he was permitted by the king to do this so he wouldn't get burned at the stake. In 1537, the Matthew Bible came out. That also was a disguised version of the Tyndale translation. Why go to all that extra bother? We got Tyndale's work, let's just do this. 1539, something called the Taverner Bible. Wonder where that was. Anyway. Arrival and revised release of the Matthew Bible, inciting the first accusation of piracy, copyright infringement. And that's starting to be a thing. And then 1539 came the Great Bible. The Great Bible was the first English translation to be authorized by King Henry VIII. Authorized becomes a very important word. Authorized. Authorized means, I want this Bible in my country. And it's so authorized by the king. It also borrows extensively from Tyndale, but it changes the things the king didn't like. In some places, Tyndale's translation would speak very clearly against the authority of the king, the supremacy of the king over everyone. Is the king subject to God? Henry VIII didn't want that. Hey, I am the head of the church. I am as the Pope is. But the Bible would teach that the king must subject himself to God too. He didn't like that. He also said that the Presbyterian form of government, eldership, church run by eldership, is pressed in the English translation. He didn't like that. He wanted the Anglican Episcopalian style of government not spoken against, and so the translation had to accede to his preferences. And it was supplemented from the Vulgate and German translations. Come on. Then came the Geneva Bible, 1560. The Geneva Bible is a translation into English from Geneva, Switzerland. That's the name. It's not done in England. It's not done under Henry VIII's thumb. It's produced independently. The chief reformers are all involved. It involves the work of Calvin, Beza, Coverdale, Hill, and others. And the translation for this is done mostly during the time of Mary I. She was a Catholic, so there's no doing it. There's no circulate in England right now. It was so well liked, it became the official Bible in Scotland right away, kind of like the Westminster Confession. When that was approved, Scotland embraced it wholeheartedly, even though England, not so much. The language of the Geneva Bible was immediately preferred over the Great Bible because the language of the Geneva Bible was forceful and vigorous. It spelled out exactly what the Lord was saying in His Word. McAfee says it drove the Great Bible off the field by sheer power of excellence. The Geneva Bible was just a marvelous Calvinistic world and life view Bible. And it also came with annotations and explanatory notes that were Calvinistic. If you have a Bible today, you have not only annotations, but you also have little paragraphs perhaps in the bottom that help to explain what this text means. And most editions today have that. They call it the Study Bible, and most of them have those. That started with the Geneva Bible. And of course, it would be along the lines of a Calvinistic world and life view, not according to the supremacy of the King of England. The notes were Calvinistic and Puritan in the character. The Geneva Bible was the primary Bible of all of 16th century Protestantism. It was carried by the Pilgrims on the Mayflower when they crossed over in 1620. Benjamin Franklin liked the Geneva Bible so much that he took the inspiration from the frontispiece illustration, and he designed it as the first great seal of the United States. And German historian, 19th century German historian von Randt says that Calvin was virtually the founder of America because of the Geneva Bible. But politics always play a role now about the publisher's profits, and that, of course, is true today. The Calvinist annotations in the Geneva Bible, now King James I, didn't like it. He didn't like the idea that in some places a king was referred to as tyrant. And so he wanted to do away with this. The Geneva Bible's got to be replaced. It's got the Presbyterian system is very clearly laid out, and it won't work in an Anglican system. And so he commissions for another Bible to be printed. The first is the Bishop's Bible. That's the second authorized version by the king, and it was a successor to the Great Bible. As with the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible was aimed at the pulpits. It wasn't meant to be distributed broadly. It was just meant to be in the churches, and so it wasn't produced in such a large fashion. But the quality of the translation of the Bishop's Bible wasn't that good. It even bothered the people that printed it that it wasn't as good as it should have been. That came with the authorization for yet another Bible. King James wanted another Bible that upheld his lofty role as king and also the form of government of the Anglican Church. And so in 1611, the third authorized version and became a successor to the Bishop's Bible. It was aimed to conform to Anglican ecclesiology and Episcopal government. It was not targeted for the pulpit. It was targeted not for the pulpit, but for the population. This was supposed to reach everybody. But the King James Version was pronounced in one very simple way, and that was its style was very majestic, very lofty, elegant English. And if you read a King James Bible today, you will find that that is the very way it's structured. It uses vocabulary that you and I don't. It's wide sweeping. No matter where you read it, it is eloquent. It is majestic language. It flows off the tongue readily. The only problem with that is that's not how the apostles spoke. That's not how they wrote. They did not write in flowery poetic language. That became probably one of the biggest criticisms. Here is the frontispiece for the original King James, and I want to end this by pointing this out to you. The Holy Bible continuing the Old New Testament, yada, 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 and you can't read it, but I want to focus on one thing here. It says, imprinted at London by Robert Barker, printer to the kings. That's my legacy. Oh, but the story goes on. The story goes on. The initial authorized version didn't sell very well. Everybody liked the Geneva Bible. So we'll let the market decide, right? No. King James said, no, I order the ceasing of copying of the Geneva Bible. No more. The King James or nothing. Well, Barker is a businessman. And so he said, yes, sir, but then continued to print the Geneva Bible anyway, putting the 1599 date, which was when it was legal, and continued to produce it even up to 1625. He was doing very well. See, he fits, yeah, that's my legacy. Oh, but it gets worse. He made a couple of very strategic mistakes in his publications. One edition of the Bible he made in 1613 got the nickname the Judas Bible, because at one point in the gospel it replaced Jesus with Judas. Can't do that. And the worst one came out in 1631. It was nicknamed the Wicked Bible because he left the word not out of the seventh commandment. By this time, the king had had enough. By the order of the king, the printing was canceled of the Wicked Bible. Printing was canceled. The majority of the copies of the Wicked Bible were collected up and they were burned. We still have 11 today. Barker was called to the Star Chamber. This is bad news. And he was fined 300 pounds and he lost his printing license. And the poor bum finally was imprisoned because he was so far in debt, and he died in debtor's prison in 1635. That, ladies and gentlemen, is my legacy.